He sang on the streets of Zanzibar with nothing but an oud and a voice that stopped tourists in their tracks. But when the world finally listened, he had to choose global stardom or the woman who believed in him before anyone else. Subscribe to African Legends and Stories for more unforgettable tales rooted in love, culture, and truth, because some stories deserve to be heard by the whole world. The morning breeze drifted through the narrow streets of Stone Town, carrying the scent of sea salt and cloves. In a shaded corner near the old Portuguese fort, Zamani adjusted the strap of his oud, a pear-shaped stringed instrument similar to a lute that hummed with every brush of his fingers. He began to sing, his deep, velvety voice rising above the bustle of the market. Tourists slowed their steps, some tossing coins into the worn straw mat laid before him. But Zamani did not see them. He only felt the air shift with their presence and heard the quiet awe in their silence. Blind since birth, Zamani moved through the world like a man reading music written on the wind. He knew when Bakari the spice vendor was approaching by the rhythm of his limp. He could tell the time by the way sunlight warmed the stone beneath his feet. Each morning, after helping his grandmother steep tea, he walked to the square with his oud and played old Swahili ballads, songs his mother once sang before she passed. Music was more than a livelihood for Zamani. It was his way of being, his anchor, his light. Life was modest, but his days were filled with melody and meaning. That peace held firm until one afternoon, when a foreign voice rose from the crowd, and with it came an offer that threatened to change everything. The man introduced himself as Philippe Moreau, a music producer from Paris who claimed he had traveled the world searching for voices that stirred the soul. He spoke quickly, his French accent thick, but his words clear. "Your voice," he said, leaning in close, "could fill opera halls in Europe. You have a gift, Zamani." His presence disrupted the usual rhythm of the square. Tourists whispered, and locals watched with quiet suspicion. Zamani didn't answer right away. He was used to compliments, flattery even, but never a proposition like this. Felipe painted vivid images, recording studios in Johannesburg, live shows in Nairobi, streaming deals, and finally, Paris. Fame, fortune, an escape from the daily hustle. But Zamani felt the weight of each word like a song he didn't yet know how to sing. That night, he sat quietly on the balcony with his grandmother, Bibi Asha. She listened without interruption, then gently placed a hand on his knee. "Music can lift you, yes," she said, "but don't let it carry you so far you forget where your heart lives." Before Philippe left Zanzibar, he asked Zamani to consider a recording session. "Just one song," he said, with urgency in his voice. "Let's see what we can create." Reluctantly, Zamani agreed, not because he sought fame, but because something inside him was curious. The session was set in a modest studio near the port, where the walls were lined with peeling soundproof foam and the air smelled faintly of seaweed and wood polish. Philippe arrived with a quiet companion, a violinist named Amina, whose presence was calm yet commanding. She carried her instrument like it held secrets. Amina spoke softly, with a tone that balanced confidence and humility. "What shall we play?" she asked Zamani as she rosined her bow. He smiled in her direction. "Something true." And so they began. His fingers moved over the oud strings with practiced ease, and her bow danced across the violin in perfect harmony. What unfolded was a melody born of instinct, raw, emotional, and unlike anything Philippe had ever heard. The producer stared, wide-eyed, as if witnessing lightning caught in a bottle. When the final note faded, the room held a rare silence. "This," Philippe said, nearly breathless, "this is gold." Zamani left the studio that day with more questions than answers. He had sung for years in the streets, but never before had someone played with him like that, like they were listening from the inside out. He couldn't see Amina's face, but he could feel something unspoken between them, a spark not born of fame or ambition, but shared truth. As he walked home, the notes of their duet lingered in his mind like the scent of cloves after rain. For the first time, Zamani wondered if perhaps music wasn't just his path, but his destiny. Amina found Zamani near his usual spot the following morning, the oud cradled in his lap as he tuned it by ear. She held out a brown paper bag filled with ripe mangoes. "Payment," she teased, "for making my violin sound better than it ever has." Zamani chuckled, his fingers pausing on the strings. "I should be the one paying you," he replied. They sat beneath the shade of a leaning coconut tree, peeling the fruit with their hands and talking as juice dripped from their fingers. There was no crowd, no producer, just two musicians who spoke the same language without needing many words. As the sun dipped lower into the ocean, Amina told him more about herself. She had studied classical music in Nairobi, but returned to Zanzibar after her father's passing. "He used to say the violin could mimic the human voice," she said, "and I think he was right." She played a soft tune to demonstrate, and Zamani, eyes closed, nodded slowly. "Your violin sings sadness with grace," he said, "like it's smiling through tears." She smiled at that. No one had ever described her playing that way. For Zamani, each moment with Amina unfolded like a new verse in a favorite song. They began meeting often, some days to play, others just to walk or sit in quiet companionship. Amina described the colors of the sky at sunset or the deep maroon of her favorite head wrap, painting pictures Zamani could only imagine. In turn, he shared the sounds of the streets, the laughter of vendors, the chatter of birds at dawn. It was a friendship growing on shared understanding, a rhythm slowly weaving into harmony. But even in those golden moments, neither of them dared ask what would happen when the music stopped, or worse, when one of them had to leave. Zamani stood by the shoreline, his bare feet sinking into the cool sand as the waves lapped softly around his ankles. The early morning light painted the ocean in strokes of gold and blue. Clutched in his hand was the plane ticket Philippe had sent, a one-way journey to Johannesburg. The contract was tucked into his satchel, its fine print promising exposure, fortune, and an international audience. Behind him, the town still slept, except for Amina, who stood a few paces away. Her silence spoke more than any goodbye. "Go," she said finally, her voice steady but low. "But don't become someone you can't find your way back from." He turned toward her, his heart heavy. "Will you wait?" he asked. Amina looked away for a long moment before answering. "I'll play," she said. "And if your song ever returns to Zanzibar, maybe I'll hear it." She didn't ask him to stay. He didn't ask her to follow. It wasn't a love confessed in grand declarations, but in restraint, in the ache of letting someone choose their path. When Zamani finally boarded the ferry that would take him to the mainland, he held her memory close like a familiar chorus he hoped never to forget. The flight to Johannesburg was both exhilarating and disorienting. Zamani had never left Zanzibar before, let alone flown through clouds. Philippe met him at the airport, all smiles and urgency, ushering him straight into the whirlwind. Studio sessions, vocal coaching, wardrobe fittings, branding meetings. Zamani moved from hotel rooms to rehearsal halls, his days filled with microphones and flashing cameras. Yet each night, alone in his room, he would run his fingers across the strings of his oud and hum the melodies Amina once helped bring to life. He was climbing, yes, but he wasn't sure if he was rising or simply drifting further from himself. Zamani's name was now spoken in music circles far beyond Zanzibar. After only 3 months in Johannesburg, he had signed with a continental label and performed alongside rising Afrobeat stars. His voice, rich and soulful, was draped over glossy productions and modern beats. His debut single, Mapenzi Bila Mwisho, topped charts in Nairobi, Accra, and Lagos. People called him the Blind Flame of Zanzibar, a name crafted by Philippe's marketing team to stir curiosity and admiration. He was invited to red carpets, praised for his humility, his mystery, his authenticity. Yet inside, Zamani felt himself drifting, like a kite untethered from the ground. The music had changed. Studio producers pushed for sleek, fast-paced tracks layered with synthetic percussion. They said the oud was too old-fashioned and his Swahili lyrics were too local. Felipe tried to assure him it was a small compromise for global appeal. "We're taking you international," he said. "You have to meet the world halfway." Zamani nodded, but his songs began to feel unfamiliar, as if someone else was singing through him. The crowds cheered, but the applause echoed hollow. He tried reaching Amina again. He called, sent voice messages, even asked Felipe to help track her down. But each attempt ended in silence. Sometimes he'd find himself sitting alone in his hotel room, strumming soft, half-forgotten melodies that belonged to his former life, the ones she had played with him, the ones that reminded him who he was before the lights. He wondered if she was still in Zanzibar, still playing the violin under the same tree. He missed the quiet honesty of her presence more than he missed home itself. And with each passing day, he feared that the world might soon forget the Zamani who once played simply for joy, not for fame. Paris dazzled beneath a gray winter sky, its old rooftops dusted with snow, its streets alive with music, chatter, and light. Zamani arrived wearing a designer coat and dark sunglasses, guided by an assistant through the sliding doors of the Théâtre de Lumière. This was to be his biggest performance yet, his European debut. The venue, with its gilded balconies and red velvet seats, had hosted legends, and tonight it would host him. Felipe paced backstage with a mixture of pride and nerves. "You've made it," he told Zamani. "This is the world stage. Sing like it's your last breath." Zamani nodded politely, but inside, his spirit stirred with unease. The setlist had been carefully crafted, opening with a high-energy anthem, followed by 3 popular tracks, ending with the hit that made him famous. But as the lights dimmed and the crowd erupted into applause, something shifted in him. The beat began. He sang the first song, then the second. But halfway through the third, his fingers stopped strumming, his voice faltered. He reached for his oud, long neglected but never forgotten. Ignoring the playlist, he began to play an old Swahili lullaby, one his mother used to hum, one Amina had once accompanied with her violin. The audience grew still. The song was slow, aching, full of memory. Zamani's voice cracked once, but he kept singing. When the final note faded, the silence hung for a breathless moment. Then came the applause. Not thunderous, but deep and honest. Backstage, Felipe was furious. "What was that?" he demanded. "You went completely off script." But Zamani simply turned toward him and said, "That was me." For the first time in months, he had sung not for the stage, not for the market, but for his own soul. And it felt like coming home. That night, after the show, Zamani walked alone along the banks of the Seine, his oud strapped across his back like a trusted companion. The streets sparkled with reflections from street lamps and riverside cafes. Lovers whispered on benches, violins sang from subway corridors, and the world seemed to hum with music. Yet in the middle of it all, he felt small, like a note lost in a song too big. The applause from earlier echoed in his mind, but it could not drown out the growing ache in his chest. For the first time, he realized that everything he had gained was still not enough to fill the silence left by what he'd lost. Back at the hotel, Zamani opened a drawer and felt something soft brush his fingers. It was a scarf, woven with bold red and gold patterns, the same scarf Amina had worn the day of their recording session in Zanzibar. Tucked beneath it was a small block of violin rosin, its surface worn from use. She had left it behind months ago, and somehow it had followed him across continents. He held it to his chest, a lump forming in his throat. In that quiet moment, the path before him became clear. He had run toward fame, toward the noise and the glitter, but the music that lived in his bones didn't come from studios or charts. It came from mango trees, cobbled streets, and the quiet harmony of 2 instruments meeting under a Zanzibari sky. He stayed up the rest of the night strumming familiar melodies, letting his fingers find their way back home through sound. As dawn began to stretch across the Paris skyline, he packed his oud carefully, folded the scarf with care, and booked a ticket to Zanzibar. Not to reclaim what was lost, but to rediscover who he had been before the world listened. When Zamani stepped off the ferry in Zanzibar, the island greeted him like a long-lost son. The scent of cloves and ocean salt filled his lungs, familiar and grounding. The streets of Stone Town hummed with life, vendors shouting over ripe fruit, children darting through alleys, old men playing bow beneath fig trees. Whispers followed him as he walked. "Is that Zamani?" He came back? Some watched with curiosity, others with quiet reverence. But he wasn't there for spectacle. He walked slowly, letting the rhythm of the island seep back into his bones, as if each step rewrote a line of a forgotten song. At his grandmother's home, Bibi Asha stood frozen on the threshold, her weathered hands pressed to her mouth. Then, with tears streaming down her cheeks, she embraced him tightly. "You've seen the world," she said softly, "but I see you've brought your heart back." They sat together that evening, sipping chai beneath the stars as she listened to everything: his rise, the crowds, the silence, and the song in Paris. She didn't scold. She simply nodded, holding his hand. "Fame is wind," she murmured, "but love, that's soil." The next morning, Zamani returned to his old spot near the fort. He unfolded his straw mat, placed his oud on his lap, and began to play, not to perform, but to remember. Locals gathered slowly, listening. The music, stripped of glamour, was full of warmth. And though the square was never empty, a part of him was searching, listening, for a single note, a familiar step, a presence. Days passed. Then, one evening as the tide pulled back and the horizon bled orange and pink, a single violin answered his song from the edge of the square. The melody curled in the air, delicate and clear. Amina had heard him. She stepped into the light slowly, her violin cradled gently beneath her chin. Amina's eyes met Zamani's face, and for a moment, neither of them said a word. The crowd around them faded as their music took shape, her bow moving instinctively, his fingers dancing across the oud like no time had passed. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished, but it was real. Their duet filled the square with something deeper than applause could ever match. When the final note faded, the air seemed to hold its breath. Amina lowered her instrument. "You came back," she whispered. Zamani nodded, his voice soft. "I sang in every city," he said, "but none of them heard me like you did." After the crowd dispersed, they sat together by the sea, the moon casting silver across the waves. Amina spoke first, her voice careful. "I wasn't angry," she said. "I just didn't want to hear you forget yourself." Zamani reached for her hand. "I nearly did," he admitted, "but your silence reminded me of who I was." She looked at him then, not with judgment, but with understanding. "You were always going to go," she said. "I just didn't know if you'd come back whole." From that night onward, they began playing together again, not for the world, but for each other, sometimes at local weddings, sometimes on quiet rooftops. People started gathering not just for entertainment, but for connection. Their music was different now, richer, layered with memory and distance and reunion. It was not the polished sound of studios, but the sound of truth and forgiveness. And though they never said it outright, love had crept back in, softly, like a song you didn't know you'd memorized until your lips sang it in the dark. A few months later, Philippe returned to Zanzibar. He arrived with a fresh deal in hand, this time tailored not just for Zamani, but for both him and Amina. "Duets," he said, spreading out glossy pages on a cafe table. "A tour across Africa, Europe, the Americas. Creative control, live instrumentation, no gimmicks, no changes to your sound. It was everything an artist could ask for. Freedom, reach, respect, Philippe looked between them eagerly. This time, the world will hear you as you are, together. His voice was sincere. He had seen what their music could do and believed it could reach even farther. Amina looked at Zamani, searching his expression for guidance. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he listened, to the ocean crashing in the distance, to the laughter of children playing in the alley behind them, to the faint hum of his grandmother preparing tea. Then he reached across the table and touched Amina's wrist. "Would you go?" he asked. She hesitated, then smiled softly. "Not if it means losing what we've built." They both turned to Philippe. "We're honored," Zamani said, "but we've already found our stage." Instead of leaving again, they began recording from a small studio they built near the edge of town, close enough to hear the sea. Their songs were uploaded online, raw, live, full of heart. Slowly, their music spread across the continent and beyond. No big press, no media frenzy, but stories began to emerge of people moved to tears by a melody, or healing through a line in Swahili they didn't even understand. Fame didn't knock as loudly this time, but fulfillment did. They had chosen each other, and in doing so, they had chosen truth. And that, Zamani realized, was the kind of legacy worth building. Years passed like verses in a well-loved song, some fast and bright, others slow and reflective. In a shaded courtyard lined with bougainvillea and shells, Zamani and Amina lived a life full of quiet joy. Children would gather in the afternoons, their legs folded on woven mats, listening as Zamani strummed his oud and told stories between melodies. "I once chased the world," he'd say, laughing gently, "but found it waiting right here." His hair had thinned, silver streaking his beard, but his voice still carried the same rich warmth that once stopped crowds in their tracks. Amina taught music to girls from the village, training fingers to find beauty in strings and breath. She no longer needed grand stages. Her joy came from seeing a young student coax a clear note from a violin for the first time. Together, she and Zamani turned Bibi Asha's old house into a small music school, painted in soft blues and yellows. They named it Nyumba ya Sauti, the home of sound. Some days they played for tourists passing through, other times just for themselves, under the mango tree where they had once shared fruit and nervous smiles. Their fame faded from headlines, but their music endured in the memories they shaped. A wedding song here, a lullaby passed down there. People came not to meet stars, but to feel something real. And every evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden shadows across the courtyard, Zamani and Amina would sit side by side, instruments in hand, and play. The notes were slower now, tender but full, because in the end, Zamani's greatest song wasn't the one that reached Paris or topped the charts. It was the one he sang when the world went quiet, and love was all that remained. Stories connect us to our past, shape our present, and guide our future. African Legends and Stories is more than just storytelling. It is a bridge between yesterday and tomorrow, between tradition and modernity. Subscribe now and be part of this journey. Like, comment, and share to keep these legends alive. This is African Legends and Stories, where the past speaks and the future listens.